My wife and I went on a couple of trips with a company called Worldwide Country Tours. The country part is significant here because they are the people who publish Country Magazine, Birds and Blooms, and a number of other publications such as that, including Taste of Home, which is the largest, has the largest circulation of any of the food magazines in the country. I made my connection, in essence, because both the fellow who owns this company and I are graduates of Iowa State. Although his major in school was journalism, he is really a lover of gardens, and he gave Iowa State the money to put a 15-acre display garden at the entrance, main entrance to the campus. So he is interested in gardening. Most of the people who go on these tours tend to be middle-aged to retirees. You will find occasional grandparent that goes on it, takes it like a recent graduate, a granddaughter, a grandson, that sort of thing. We have found them to be very compatible groups. They've come, the one last year that we'll show you some slides of, had people from as far west as Washington State, and somebody was there from, I forget whether it was Maine, I think, but it was quite a diverse group. They were diverse in many other ways, although they tended to get along quite well together. The fellow from Washington was a retired school superintendent. He was so meticulous in this, so well organized, that he had, from the internet, a complete booklet of every place we were going to visit. He had bound it, and it was that thick. So he had all the information. His wife said that she had a bit of trouble with him when he first retired. The first time that she was away shopping, he arranged her cupboards alphabetically. So he, it's what sort of a person he was. But we all got together well, and previous trip to England was with a bunch of corporate extension agents from New York, and we did tend to stay in college dormitories, that sort of thing. The food was rather, shall we say, greasy. But on this trip, I was really quite pleased. We couldn't complain about the food. Those free meals that we were on our own for, in other words, most of us went to one of the local pubs, and we enjoyed it very much. So without any further information other than the fact that Martha went on one of their tours too, except she went to Ireland. I guess she just wanted to kiss the Blarney Stone, but in any case, we'll get into the slides and tell you about this trip to visit English gardens. We'll get some of those back there too, and I think we'll be on our way. Yeah, we'll tell you about that afterwards. Okay. Everyone, of course, who's been involved with gardening in any sense of the word is aware of the Chelsea Flower Show. And I do have one of their catalogs. You probably won't be able to see it now, but you can pass it around when you have an opportunity to do so. It's about a 15-acre site. You will have gardens. You will also have pavilions with flower arrangements, horticultural displays, etc. It's on the grounds of the Chelsea Hospital. The Chelsea Hospital, during wartime, has been, of course, a traditional hospital for wounded. At this point, however, it is the home, like a veteran's home, in effect. It's the home for the Royal Guards that have retired. So that the people you see with the fur hats and the red coats and so forth that perform in all the parades and functions, when they retire, this is their home. The profits from the Chelsea Flower Show actually go into maintaining that as a home for them. Chelsea Flower Show probably is the most heavily attended flower show that exists anywhere. It's a 3-day show, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You really can't get into it as an individual at this point unless you're a member, or you can hardly get into it unless you're a member of the Royal Horticultural Society, or they reserve blocks for tourists. And that's, of course, how you get in it coming from this country, unless you join the Royal Hort Society. The attendance is reputed to be an average of 180,000 a day. It is the only flower show that I have ever seen where there were scalpers outside the front gate scalping tickets. In this country, you associate that with athletic events. And by the way, one of the 7:30 p.m. primetime shows on the BBC, 2 channels, one of them is a garden show. So the English take their gardening very, very seriously. As you can imagine, 15 acres and 180,000 people, well, this causes traffic jams all over London, literally, clear to the other side. And it tends to get crowded. My wife and I walked around first, looking at the gardens. The featured gardener, the one that had gotten all the write-ups, was one by Prince Charles, and it was a reproduction of a Persian carpet with plants. We walked around the gardens with the idea of saying to ourselves, we probably are not going to take pictures of every garden, but let's look at the best ones first. We'll come back and get them. The problem with that sort of thinking was that by the time you got ready to come back, you couldn't get near the gardens. So we should have taken them the first time around. So we didn't really get a lot of garden pictures. But this gives you an idea of the sorts of displays that they have. This was a garden that was filled with container plantings as such, and of course very spectacular. Whoops, that was all right the other day when I showed it. Anyway, we really didn't get the good gardens. This was sort of on the far end of the place, but it does give you an idea that many of these gardens do simulate the sort of backyard or side yard garden that you will see, all over England as such. Probably the thing that we enjoyed most is that there are 3 large pavilions. I would guess that each one of these is probably larger than a half a football field. I don't really know the dimensions. They're sort of in the center of the whole display with the gardens and commercial exhibits around the outside. And they consist to a large degree of entries such as this. This was an entry of chrysanthemums, probably by one of the companies that propagates chrysanthemums. That sort of lime green chrysanthemum that you see there, the spidery one, approximately 3 feet across. So these are specimen plants. This fellow is about my height. In other words, he's close to 6 feet. And there are delphiniums behind him that are a couple of feet taller than he is. Wouldn't it be nice to grow delphiniums like that in this country? Again, many of these are probably gardens that were displayed by seed companies, for example. So delphiniums. A bonsai collection. This was sponsored by the Bonsai Society, or one of the bonsai societies. Again, really perfect specimens. And other societies, for example, the Hosta Society had a good display of hostas, and they passed out a little sheet on hosticulture, and they recommended as a control for slugs a plant, the extract or juices from a plant called Phytolacca. I see a few smiles, but not much recognition. Pokeweed. You cut off the tips and put them in a bucket or something, probably stomp them a bit, and then use the juice or the fluid that you get there, the liquid, to spray. Now, I have not yet tried it, but I think I will this year. But that was their recommendation. Beg pardon? That's the common poke salad. Yeah, poke salad. This should be a natural control in this part of the world. And this is Russell lupins. And if you look at the, on the right-hand corner, you just barely see him, but you see a guy's head. And again, he's probably around 6 feet tall. So you see how well these sorts of things do in the English climate. We have always tended to hear that English climate, is wet. You get a lot of rainfall. How much rainfall do we get here a year? somewhere between 40 and 45. How much rainfall do they get in London on an average?
About the same.
20 inches. But you've got an island climate as such, with not, actually when it gets to be 75, the English just begin to get uncomfortable. It's getting too hot for them. So you see, it conserves moisture as such, and you get by then with much less moisture to grow a crop than you would here. Sweet peas. Imagine walking by a display of sweet peas like that, and the fragrance. And probably each one of those, and these are like the florist cans, just filled full of them, so that each one of those is pretty close to 2 feet across, as far as the display is concerned. Again, probably a seed company. And then you have, you know, garden flowers such as the iris. The remarkable thing about a flower show such as this, of course, is that you will see things that perhaps outdoors bloomed a month before. You'll see things that are outdoors are blooming now, but you'll also see things that won't bloom for about another month. So this means that probably at least a third of the things in the show have to be manipulated, either refrigerated for some time to hold them back, or given extra heat in a greenhouse facility to keep them coming on. Cactus. Now you tell me that cacti are not colorful. And this again would have been one of the plant societies over there. There were vegetables. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a dark slide, partly because it's against black velvet. On Long Island, of course, the North Shore has been called the Gold Coast, and it's where anybody who made any money in any place in the country ended up having a home, particularly as soon as they moved their main office into New York City. North Shore of Long Island was easy to get to. Vanderbilt actually built the Long Island Railroad so that he would have access to his estates on Long Island, and so other people could get there too. In fact, the first paved road on Long Island was the Vanderbilt Expressway that he built to race his cars on weekends, and then he opened it up to the public during the work week so they could drive to New York City on it. One of the estates had a gardener. In fact, his name was Adam Gardner, who was a Scotsman. And before he came to this country to be a gardener on one of these estates, he worked for one of the large landowners in England growing vegetables for the Chelsea Flower Show. Okay, his recipe for a 3-foot-long carrot. First, you auger a hole about 4 feet deep. You backfill it with a prepared soil. You sow a few seeds on top. As they come up, you select the healthiest plant and grow it on then to 3 feet in length. So these weren't quite 3 feet. The parsnips probably were about 2.5 feet, but an idea of what the vegetables are like. Now, we said the Chelsea Flower Show gets crowded. This is why we didn't get back to photograph the gardens. This was about 10:30 in the morning, by the way. There would be as many as 30 people deep around the gardens. In other words, you get in line and you work up one at a time. So it really is a spectacular display of crowds. The company that, the tour company, is talking now about having a second one later in the season. And Hampton Court has a flower show that they say is the equivalent of this one, but it is not as crowded as such, so that it would include that. Okay, by the way, usually I get asked what those trees are flowering. There's one with the sort of purple flower in the back, or mauvish flower, and then the red one. Those are horse chestnuts. And English climate is perfect for horse chestnuts. In the Midwest, with our hot, dry summers, the leaves scorch very badly, so that we seldom see them here. Even in upstate New York, they tend to scorch. Well, there was a subway station or underground station about 3 blocks from Chelsea. When we took a look and saw that kind of crowd, my wife and I decided to leave early. We walked the 3 blocks to the station, and we went downtown London, and the underground there is so easy to find your way around on. It's really very simple. So we visited Westminster Abbey. We visited the tower, the Jewel Tower, where they used to keep the jewels. We got back on the subway, went out to the Tower of London, where we did see the crown jewels, etc. So in other words, there is time on these tours to do other things. Some built in, and in this case, it was sort of impromptu, shall we say. But before we left, we saw this. It was the commercial display of an American company. So I said, let's get a picture of that. Here's an American company that exhibits in the Chelsea Flower Show. So when I was taking this picture, I had the camera up to my eyes, focusing it. My wife was at my left elbow. And I said, I wonder if Horace made it to the show this year. There was a fellow on my right elbow also focusing his camera, and he said, no, but Jim did. Oh. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I said, I used to write PR for Miracle-Gro. Miracle-Gro and Scott's have merged. And he says, that's what I do here. Oh. And Horace is the guy who founded Miracle-Gro. He invented it. But his son now heads the combined company. So his son Jim was there at the flower show. So anyway, coincidences. One of the next places we stopped is Kew, and this is the famous old Victorian palm house. It was completely rebuilt about 15 years ago, same style as such. However, they did replace the wooden members with aluminum at this point, because these things are just terrifically costly to maintain if they're wood. You have to paint them about every other year, and then take them apart every 5 to 10 years and completely scrape everything and repaint it, etc., even if they are rot-resistant wood. Kew is a large place. It's 300 and some acres. It was one of those gardens where they, in its early days, their specialty was collecting plants, particularly from the New World, and bringing them there to be tested, tried. Actually, they were probably more interested in just collecting plants than anything else. And many of those then have grown up to the point where some of these trees, and many of these would be American varieties, now are the skyline, if you will. In around 1984, I forget the exact date, a hurricane hit the area, took out a great many of the big old trees. There's still left some here. I was at the New York Botanical Garden, and they suggested that I write to Kew, to the horticulturists there whom I knew, and see if there's anything we could do to help them recover. And John Simmons wrote back to me and said, well, he said it really was devastating, but he said, you know, we had a nursery full of new plants and no place to plant them. He says, now we got space to plant. So he didn't really need our help. The rock garden at Kew. In the background is the Princess of Wales Conservatory. It has, I think, if I remember correctly, 5 different habitats, ranging from desert to tropical rainforest, and the appropriate plants and humidities and so forth for that. Rock garden is, of course, is an old garden. It's mature. In England, it really has to be contrived because they really didn't have a lot of rock outcroppings such as this. Our rock garden at the New York Botanical Garden was built by T.H. Everett, who had had his training at Kew, and that was what he considered to be his specialty. We were in the rock garden looking at these plants in flower when a rather elderly couple came up. Elderly these days is anyone older than I am. And with a strong, deep Southern accent, he asked the name of a plant. And, you know, I'd been pointing to things with my wife, and I suppose he figured I knew him, and luckily I did. And he introduced himself as a retired nurseryman from Alabama. And then I said, from around Sims? And he said, yes, how did you know? And he's the reason we didn't see more of Kew Gardens, because he was just such a friendly puppy dog of a guy that you couldn't get away from him. But that was kind of nice. I'd been here before. One story about the Kew Gardens. When I was in New York many years ago, I wrote an article about John Bartram for the New York Times. And how many of you know John Bartram or his story? Okay. Bartram was a Quaker farmer. He was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. The two started the first scientific society in this country to correspond with like societies in Europe, particularly England and Germany. He was a self-taught botanist. At one time, he was appointed the botanist to the king in this country. His thing then was collecting plants, and he collected from as far north as the St. Lawrence River to northern Florida in the south, and nearly the Mississippi in the middle of the country. Through this scientific society, he arranged a subscription service with many of those people who were vying with each other, actually, to get the newest plants from the New World. What he would do is that every year he would ship so many trunk loads of plants, seeds, cuttings, primarily seeds and bulbs, that he had collected, and as I say, then these people would vie with each other to see who got all the latest things. Regrettably, at that point, the Prince of Wales was unable to make that contact. He just hadn't made that contact with Bartram. So he envied all those people that were getting these things. So I wrote a story about Bartram in the New York Times, and I got back a letter from one of his descendants in the Philadelphia area, 5 or 6 generations down the line. And she said, "Are you aware that had it not been for John Bartram, we might still be an English colony?" And she went on to explain. Okay, since the Prince of Wales had been unable to get these things, he really envied his peers, etc. Finally, the contact was made. Bartram shipped him 3 trunk loads of plant material. They arrived on a cold, wet day in November. The prince insisted on going out with the gardeners and supervising the planting of these things. He caught pneumonia and died. Kew was his garden. The assumption here is that since he would rather garden than rule and was a meek, mild sort of a guy who loved flowers, that we might have gotten along with him. We didn't with his son, George III. Interestingly enough, on a corner of Kew is a sort of rust-colored building that still exists. For a time, it was the herbarium for Kew, and it is the home that even George III preferred to live in during his reign rather than the palaces that were available to him. Actually, his tyrannical moods and so forth were the product of a disease. I can't remember the name of it. It really wasn't that he was that inherently nasty. But at any rate, we didn't get along well with him. So the assumption is, had his father ascended to the throne, we might not have separated from him. And I asked the people at Kew, and it's a true story. Okay, Wisley. While Kew is the Royal Botanical Garden, this is the Botanical Garden of the Royal Horticultural Society. This is the famous house at Kew, beautiful structure. There was a garden up along the Hudson in New York that had a house patterned after this. The husband of the woman who built it actually was a sculptor, and he hauled rocks out of the woods and created interesting designs with the rocks out of the woodlands there in New York. They left the garden and the house in a trust, but no money to support it. So the trustees dynamited the house instead of going out and raising money. It was really a travesty. Everybody was really upset about that. But anyway, it's a house that was patterned after the one at Kew. And Kew, again, is primarily a demonstration garden, since it's the garden of a botanical society as such. Excellent collections of alpine plants, demonstration gardens, and we were there in the spring. This was taken in the fall. The problem was my camera went out at this garden, so I had to pull a couple of slides just to show you what it was like from the previous time I'd been there in the fall. This is September. They get good color in their gardens in September when we're sort of figuring on putting them to bed. Again, it's the climate. When we were there, before the camera conked out, we did get some shots of some of the azaleas, rhododendrons, hostas had just come out, so that the early spring plantings, in other words, were in full bloom. What is this? This is a Kew. Okay, it is a tripod from what they call pea brush. They prune the limbs from birch trees, and if they were planting a row of what we call here English peas, they would just stick these little twigs, branches, down the line right in the middle of the peas, and the peas will climb up through them and be supported. When I first saw this in some Long Island gardens, I thought, oh, how tacky. But once it really gets established, it really works better than any kind of stakes you're going to put in the ground, and it really is quite attractive. Okay, this is a tripod, 3 of them tied together at the top like you would pole beans, with clematis planted at the base. They just, in fact, the guy just got up from putting it in when I did get that photograph. I'm only going to be able to put 2 or 3 slides of any particular garden in here, just simply because to get you a feel of some of these, there's not enough to put in a lot of detail. Being the garden that it is, however, there are extensive trials. This was again taken when I was there in September, their chrysanthemum trials. When we were there in the spring, they were just in the process of planting those things. This is Fayetteville garden. And Fayetteville is on the Windsor Great Castle grounds. It was the pet product, or project rather, of the Queen then, who is now the Queen Mum. It's about a 40-acre garden. It's much more intimate as a 40-acre garden than Kew is as a 340-acre garden. So this is one that people tend to like very much. And again, since my camera was still out, I had to go buy another camera, by the way, when I got a chance to do it. But this was a picture taken in September when I was there probably about 15 years ago. Rose garden is still there, looks much the same. Planting of heaths and heathers. Dr. John Holland, who was here last week, actually has a heather planting, which seems to be doing quite well up in the Rogers area. And just a view across the garden, the main alley with the smaller gardens off to the side of it. This is headcoat. It is considered by most people to be the best example of the architectural, or the use of architecture in a garden, to divide it into garden rooms. And that architecture can be plants used architecturally, or it can be stone walls, brick walls, etc. And you'll see some of all of them at Headcoat. This is also where I introduced the people on the tour to the ha-ha ditch. Who knows what a ha-ha ditch is? She does. Okay. Okay, let's say you own some palace on top of a little knoll, and you'd love to look across a rolling meadow at a woods in the background or a river out there, and you'd like to see sheep or cattle grazing out there. How are you going to keep the sheep or cattle out of your more intimate gardens up around the palace? What would you do? Build a fence. But who wants to look at a fence? So you create a ditch, a ha-ha ditch, and you put the fence in the bottom of the ditch. You can't see it. Now, I've never have really seen any definitive answers to where the ha-ha came from. But knowing that the English, particularly out in the countryside, love to ride horses, I can just see someone riding, chasing hounds or some such thing, and suddenly the horse puts on all 4 brakes because the horse sees that ha-ha ditch, and the guy goes over the fence and lands on his head. Ha-ha. Anyway. But this is sort of the main alley through Headcoat. Headcoat, by the way, it's an American garden. An American captain after World War II stayed there and built this garden. He had good funding. His mother was a Whitney from this country. And the only problem was that she gave him enough money to build it, but then when she died, she didn't give him any money to maintain it. So this was the first garden taken over by the National Trust, which up to that point had been preserving houses, castles, palaces, etc. So it's actually maintained by the National Trust. Each of these little garden rooms then has its own theme, its own type of garden. This tulips would have been in these beds, and they've just finished as such. And annuals haven't gone in for the summer. This is an old Atlas cedar up near the house. probably estimated to be 250 years old. Keep in mind that those round-topped evergreen trees essentially all come from areas with heavy snowfall. In other words, they can withstand the snow. In snow country, the evergreens, pines, spruces, etc., all are pyramidal, so that they tend to shed it. They don't break as many branches. How's that for a hedge? And a pleached arbor, a hedge of trees. Usually they are carpinus, related to the hornbeam. Well, they are hornbeam, but related to the one we call ironwood in this country, etc. Sheared up a little bit, sort of mini-skirted, so you can see through, but again, setting aside various areas as garden rooms. Again, we were really too early on this early spring tour to see a lot of the summer beds, but here you do see, with that Atlas cedar in the background, beds that do have color. This is the same bed shot a little bit further back, but in September, so that they do have those flowers year-round. Sylvia Henthorne on the right is from Bella Vista. She was on the tour. Her friend from Kansas City on the left, and then my wife in the middle, and that was right at wisteria flowering time at Headcoat. Blenheim Palace. Who was born here that was famous? Churchill. It is the, I can't remember which dukedom it is. I forget, but Marlborough. It is the official residence of the Duke of Marlborough. Churchill was too far down the line to inherit it as such, but this is where he was born. This is a good example of the English parkland. England initially had copied its gardening style after France, who had copied it after Spain and India, or Italy rather, with a strong Moorish influence, another for formality, walled gardens, everything done geometrically, etc. Four fountains, or four gardens as squares with a fountain in the middle, that sort of thing. Well, about the time, actually, that this new movement began, which was in the fairly early 1800s, England had cut its forests, even back as far as colonial days. One of the reasons that the New Englanders fell out with them was that they wanted to reserve all the good white pines for their use, for shipmasts. They didn't have anything left. So along came a couple of people. One's name was Reptens, R-E-P-T-E-N-S. The other was a fellow by the name of Lancelot Brown. And they would invite Lancelot Brown out, again, standing up here, you know, probably by the palace, and they'd gaze out over these 1,000 acres of land that they owned and such, and what can you do with it? In other words, they had lost nature, and they wanted to bring it back. So Lancelot Brown would stand there, gaze out over it, and sort of scratch his head a time or two, rub his chin, and say, it has capabilities. So from then on, he was known as Capability Brown. He had a bit of an ego. He had done enough of these English properties that he was in demand in Europe, in the continent. But his response to invitations was, but I haven't finished England yet. Okay. Basically, what he would do is stand there and say, you know, that river's in the wrong place, it should be over here. And, you know, you need woods here and you need a hill over there. Now, keep in mind that this is the age of men, shovels, wheelbarrows, horses, and slips. It's not the age of bulldozers and backhoes. But they literally would make nature, recreate nature better than nature had originally done it. And that's then the English parkland. And many of these old palaces and castles, such as this, in other words, will have an intimate garden up near, a parterre garden in this case, and we'll show you another picture of it. But then they would have this parkland with trails and lakes and rivers and so forth, and we'll show you a number of those as we go on. This parterre, then, you see, is right up on the terrace, right behind the palace. And then you look beyond the formal portion, and then you see what I'm talking about. And there was about a 6-mile trail that you could walk on around there. A few people took shortcuts. I was one of those guys who went with a handful of people that took the full 6 miles, it, I guess, puts you in good shape. But in any case, we'll show you other pictures of other gardens that show you what it's like to walk around a place such as that. Churchill himself bought a house during the war not far from London so that he could get away for a little bit of relief from the stress of being Prime Minister at that time. It's called Chartwell. This is that house. This is one of the gardens. You again see wisteria in bloom there. It's a fairly large rose garden. It's not a tremendously large estate, but there is an acreage of meadows and woodlands and so forth that surrounds it. This is probably the most touching visit, I think, of the lot, at least for those of us who went through the period of World War II, because there were so many mementos of Churchill there, including his voice and some of the speeches that we recall that he gave at that time. I would have to admit that I wiped my eyes a time or two, because it brought back so many memories of, people that you knew, didn't come back, etc. So it was really a very interesting visit. Again, too early for a lot of the summer color. We had been to Costa Rica in the spring, and I'd gotten a picture of my wife on one of the volcanoes up at the top in the cloud forest, above the rainforest, in the cloud forest, standing in front of a gunnera. And here was one on Churchill's estate. So I thought, well, we'll just compare gunnera as such. We'll put my wife there for perspective, you see. Anyway, the leaves of gunnera are about 3 feet or so across. Wouldn't take our summers here. That's the problem with it. I've seen it do well in northern New Jersey, but there they covered it with the doghouse in the winter to keep it alive. One of the things that they do in so much of England and so much of Europe is, if anything grows between a crack in the sidewalk or between the rocks and a wall here, immediately go out and get rid of it. Now, some of these walls, may have been there for centuries and centuries. They don't worry about it. They let the flowers grow right out of the cracks in the wall. And that's Centranthus, sometimes called red valerian, that you see there that is doing that. This is Sudeley Castle. What's the difference between a castle and a palace? Castle was built as a fortification. You lived in it too, usually. Palace was built as a home. So this is Sudeley Castle, the home of the only wife of Henry VIII that survived him. And keep in mind that these yew hedges probably are well over a century old. And we were there at the end of the hoof and mouth problem. When we first went, we had to drive across disinfectant pads with the bus, and you had to walk on them with your feet, etc. But this particular area, there was no problem, and the old cows were out among the buttercups there taking a little break. And that was just over the fence from this sort of thing. Now, if you've got your pruning shears or your hedge clippers, you probably can get a job here. And again, some of those are probably centuries old. In that garden area you see with the hedge around it there, again, if you were to come along during the summer, you'd see it primarily filled with annuals, although there are quite a few perennials in it as well. But this is, quite typical of these large estates. Windsor Castle, we did get in to see the portion of it that was open to the public. And there's several museums. There's a doll museum associated with it, a chapel where a number of famous people from history are buried, etc. However, we didn't get to see the rose garden. This guy was in the way. Last time I was there, beyond this and on the other end of the palace, there was a large rose garden. But for some reason, maybe the Queen was there, I don't know. But for some reason, we didn't get into that. But in any case, what we were able to see garden-wise is what was the old moat. Now, I guess they decided they don't need to drown the Franks or whoever it is that might come across the channel, so they've converted it into garden. Probably the most memorable thing about that particular part of the trip was the fish and chips we had at the little restaurant down at the foot of the hill. On the right is Clematis montana. One of the hardiest, one of the best ones. This is the white flowered form of it. The plant on the left of the door is Ceanothus, California lilac. It gives you an idea, in other words, that they can grow in much of England, particularly England itself, the plants you would grow in Southern California. Again, I wish that it were just a little darker. This is Kifsgate, across the road from the Headcote. Small garden, still in private hands. And this is peering through the trees at the back of the garden. This is above an escarpment that drops about 300 feet. But it gives you a good look of the English countryside. This is what people go to England to see. Here, if anything grows in a fence row, you get out the Roundup or the 2,4-D and get it right away, thus depriving wildlife of all that habitat. So we go to England to see hedgerows, and then we come back and we cut anything that might resemble a hedgerow on our own properties. But this, I think, is my favorite view of the English countryside. The little villages interspersed here and there with the view of the countryside. Again, these are fall pictures taken in that particular garden in September, but it gives you an idea. Most of the things you see there with the flowers on them are hydrangeas. They're just turning color in the fall, in September. Stourhead. This is one you see pictures of a lot. There's a trail around this lake. This one is, if I remember correctly, about 3,000 acres. And you walk around this trail around the lake. This is a grotto that you walk through on that trail. And if you look over in the far shore, always there is a scene, the textures and foliage colors and sizes and so forth of plants that is like an artist's rendering. We were there as the Exberry azaleas were in full bloom, and that's what you see on the other side. Now, for perspective, see that little guy standing there beside the one on the opposite side of the lake? Gives you an idea how big they are. And if you know my wife, this gives you an idea how big the rhododendrons are. These are ironclads. These are rhododendrons that are hybridized with Asian species and our own native, if I remember correctly, Catabiense. They are among the hardiest still for planting in this part of the country. The plant in the foreground is one of the Exberry azaleas, very fragrant. There was a young woman on the tour who could smell these 100 yards away, and she always made a dash for them. I think you'll see her a bit later on. Stourhead is noted for its so-called follies and its little architectural features here and there that you view from a distance, and many of them and others sort of resemble a ruin as such, represent that in the landscape. I didn't realize until I visited this that there is a room inside this filled with classical pieces of statuary. And this one is a little bit more exotic than the other. One of the things that this illustrates basically is that if you go on this tour and you really are unable physically to get all the way around everything, that there are places where you can stop and sit and enjoy, tea shops that are open, etc. And again, look at the people who are standing there for perspective in front of those azaleas and rhododendrons. Color is not the only thing that's important in a garden. Textures, forms, sizes. This is either English roseum or roseum elegans. They are very similar. I can't tell them apart unless I see them side by side. But again, these are probably about 15 feet tall. Do exceptionally well. And here is the woman I was mentioning about. And she really loved that azalea. By the way, that azalea has American blood in it too. I think probably calendulaceum from the southern Appalachians is part of the background of that one. Probably with Mollus as one of the other parents. What is this particular plant? Somebody the other day thought it was an astilbe on steroids. Rhubarb, ornamental rhubarb. My goodness, I thought you'd all know that one. This is a small private garden, 4 acres, out the back side of the parking lot from Stourhead that we just visited. Little old lady, she makes her living drying flowers and selling them. I bought her book. I have it if anyone wants to borrow it sometime, on recipes for drying everything, you know, individual recipes. This is what you do with hydrangeas, this is what you do with something else. She was trialing 240-some new hybrids of hydrangea from some German nursery in her garden. In the back you see little yellow spots. Those are buttercups in the pasture. As we rounded the corner, we saw sort of arms and legs coming up out of the buttercups, thrashing around a bit. And everybody was, wonder what that is, wonder what that is. Well, the lady said, I think that's my daughter-in-law sunbathing. So she yelled, and there was more thrashing in the buttercups, and finally she came out reasonably well clothed. And we all went to her. She has a little tea room there, so you have tea as you leave. But that's rhubarb. Everybody's favorite garden is Sissinghurst. Alliums, the ornamental onions in the foreground. There was our local tour guide in the background, Cora. And Cora was good. She could get you where you were supposed to be when you were supposed to be there, except that occasionally the bus driver knew a shortcut and got us there quicker. He was good too. This is the garden, of course, of Vita Sackville West, and it's best known for her use of color. You have a blue garden, you have a red garden, you have a white garden, etc., and then each one of those encompasses a range of shades within that part of the spectrum. So here you have lupins in the foreground. I'm not just too certain, I don't remember what that is in the background, but keep in mind that this is May. I've tried to sell that polygonum in the foreground at the farmer's market, can't sell it. I guess they've never seen what it'll do, but it will do well. The white garden, again, it was too early to get a lot of color. You will find during the season a lot of silver foliage in here, but you do get a feeling of white all season long. This was the last garden that we visited. This is Leonardsley. This is the rock garden. And you see those shrubs that have been severely pruned, and there's a bit of color there, but it's kind of faded. Those are all azaleas. And this, you know, if we'd been there a week before, they'd been in full bloom. But they're all wilted at this point. You can imagine how spectacular it would have been to have been there earlier. And what's that I see up in the upper left-hand corner there? Palm trees. This was the estate of Sir John Loder, and there is a Loderi rhododendron, and I'm not sure, I haven't looked it up, whether he developed this or discovered it, collected it. I'd have to check to see. But anyway, this is the rock garden. Woman in the foreground there is from Cleveland, and that's her husband there in the lower. He always wore shorts, and he had the most bowed legs I think I've ever seen. Good sense of humor. Now, this is what I was referring to earlier. You walk these paths around these lakes, around the rivers, and they may be miles, and you walk through woodlands that's pretty dense, and then suddenly you come to an opening in the woodland, and this is what you see. In other words, they tease you with this, but this is what you see. Those, again, are all azaleas. The yellows particularly are the X-berries, which were developed again with some American breeding in them or genes in them, but they were developed at the estate of the English Rothschilds. Great Dixter, Susan Farrell spent some time here a couple of years ago, and I think you see some of that in what you see in her gardens. He is noted, this is Christopher Lloyd, he's sort of the guru at this point of gardening in England, and he is noted for using things together that you wouldn't think of using together. Tropicals with annuals or temperate zone perennials as such. So you'll see some interesting combinations. Here again, growing out of a crack. Bellis perennis, English daisy. And these are all growing out of cracks in this wall. Every one of them that you see there. There are a few at the bottom, but they're all growing out of the wall. Great Dixter. And here's a good example of the sorts of things you find there. These very rigidly sheared topiary structures in the middle of a grassy meadow. The contrast between the highly maintained and the natural as such. Bird, One of those birds lost his head to vandalism, and they figured it would take him about 15 years to grow the head back. But this is the sort of thing you see, you know. Isn't that spectacular? If you see these little heads in there, little spikes that look kind of like a Timothy head, that is an endangered orchid that's hardly found in the wild at all, but this meadow is full of them. And here again, the very rigidly, formally clipped hedge in the middle of a meadow. Now, the thing that's going to differ about the tour this year is that, in essence, we get on a ferry the last couple of days, go over to France, and we will visit Monet's garden and end up in Paris. This is not the best picture of Monet's garden. I was going to spend this winter resorting my slides, but somebody came along with an interim position, and I haven't gotten back to it. But this gives you an idea of the color that you will see. And Monet's bridge is in the background there, that if you had the painting with the wisteria on it, we were a little too late for that. But anyway, we will include that. And I have just one more slide that I want to put in.